pleasure to introduce Djinnaya Stroud, a former student of mine at California College of the Arts. At CCA, on our school seal, we have the words theory and practice, because we believe that there are multiple ways for artists and makers to understand their work and the work of others and how it operates in the world. As a recent graduate, Djinnaya exemplifies both of these things and investigates ways of making and thinking about her own work and the work of others. Her thoughts on the subversive power of ornamentation help open up possibilities for looking and thinking. Djinnaya has spent the last year looking at ceramics and craft ornamentation in Japan and the United Kingdom, and is the current artist in residence at the Cooley Residency in Petaluma, California. I look forward to hearing her thoughts today and in the future. Thank you.
There is a ceramics legend that runs through writings about ornamentation. It's the story of the suffragette china painters, and it goes something like this. Women who were supportive of the cause of the suffragettes, but who for some reason couldn't publicly state that, would purchase porcelain blanks and paint on them in the London suffragette colors of violet, green, and white. Then they would display those works in their home so that if somebody came to their home and saw them who was also sympathetic to the cause, they would know that they were in a safe space. So this is not a far-fetched tale. China painting was a common, rich, white lady hobby in the late 1800s, and it was even one of the only ways that a woman of the upper middle class could work for money without losing her status. In 1884, Let Household magazine, a magazine that taught London families how to run a proper household, said that in the household, China painting affords amusement for the girls in the family during the hours their brothers and fathers leave for business. To many such ladies who have nothing better to do than novel reading, this method of filling their time will be esteemed a great boon. In other words, China painting was the sort of thing that could keep women's hands busy and keep them from being distracted from ideas like the idea of suffrage. And there are documented pieces of suffragette jewelry in these colors of violet, green, and white. And there's china that was commissioned for suffragist tea rooms. So last summer, I packed up my ideas and headed to London to go through every piece of china painting in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And after all that searching, I found not a single solitary piece, not a single solitary historic object to link to this story. But despite not having an item to validate that idea, it's still the starting point for this lecture, because whether it's true or not, like many urban legends, it illustrates to us a story about something broader than facts. In my presentation in 2015 at NCECA, I used the work of Grace and Perry to show how ornamentation on ceramic art has the ability to create gateways through which non-traditional audience members can enter into fine arts discussions. That talk was about how ornamentation opens the conversation of the art object. The story of the suffragette china painter, on the other hand, is about how ornamentation can be used to close down the arts conversation to a coded and an exclusive one. So this term, sub rosa, or under the rose, comes to us from Greek and Roman legends, in which Harpocrates is given a rose by Cupid in appreciation for keeping Venus's secret. From the imagery of that story, Romans painted the ceilings of their dining chambers with vines and roses in order to remind partygoers that things said while drinking remained in that room. Council members in the medieval ages carried that idea over by hanging a single rose from the ceiling of their chambers when what was being discussed in that room was meant to stay only in that room. In contemporary Western society, we prize transparency among almost anything else. To us, secrecy alludes to conspiracy and to dark dealings. But that's not the sort of secrecy that we're talking about when we talk about sub rosa. What we're talking about there is the sort of unfettered form of secret discussion that can only happen in these private spaces. And that type of secrecy is something that's very important, not just in contemporary culture, but also in contemporary art. So a lot of what I'm looking at here, bear with me because this is going to get really nerdy for a second, comes from the writing of Michael Warner in a book called Publics and Counterpublics that he based on the writing of Nancy Fraser. So in this book, what Warner did was combine theory, sociology, and journalism to completely dismantle traditional ideas of what a public is. But more important than that, what he did was to define for us what a counterpublic is. From the beginning definitions in the book, he wrote, "A sense of totality is brought out by speaking of the public. But whenever one is addressed as the public, the others are assumed not to matter." So if you're familiar with Grayson Perry's work, or if you're familiar with my talk from 2015, this is what he talks about when he talks about default man and how default man dictates to us what has taste and what does not have taste. Default man is the public. So Warner used this idea of public to explain why we need counterpublic space. Counterpublics are groups that exist literally counter to the public. Their members hold views or live lives that are different in paradigm or beliefs from the public so much that the public places a filter on all of their expressions within the public realm. And this happens all the time, and it's not something that we're consciously aware of until we really take the time to notice. So a counterpublic is different from one other form of public, which is called the subpublic. So subpublics are publics that are separate in interest and knowledge from the general public, but which don't activate this resistance. So Nancy Fraser talks about hunters in this, but the example that I'm going to use is comic book nerds. So a comic book nerd has a lot of knowledge that's not generally available into your general public, but nobody looks at that person and wants to exclude them completely from society. And as a lot of what we sort of saw in the news with Gamergate shows, we expect that subpublic to kind of fall in line with the progress of the general public. So a subpublic, because it's thought of as in line with our regular public, is able to self-determine who they are. They're able to make a statement of who they are without the public putting a filter on it. Now, without a counterpublic space, members of a counterpublic group lack the autonomy to create their own community statement. As Warner writes, the discourse that constitutes a counterpublic is not merely a different or alternative idiom, but one that in other contexts would be regarded with hostility or a sense of indecorousness. The sub-Rosa nature of a counterpublic discussion is critical because when the counterpublic discussion meets the dominant public discourse, it's either met with hostility or it gets lost in a sea of hashtag not all men, hashtag not all cops, hashtag not all white people. So moving this into the arts context, an artist acts the part of many publics when presenting a work. As a theoretical example, an artist is a member of the general public and the subpublic of the art world. If she's a person of color, she is a member of the subpublic of artists of color. Her work is part of the general discourse of these publics and subpublics. If she addresses racial issues within her work, and it's important to note that if you're a woman or a person of color or a queer artist, your work is automatically perceived as addressing these issues. She's doing that within the dominant public and holding space within the discourse of that public. However, that artist is also part of a counterpublic that she shares with other people of color and artists of color. So what if she wants to have the sort of discussions that are occurring in those counterpublic spaces? How does she address the members of her counterpublic in a way that is sub-Rosa, so as not to have that conversation drowned out or hijacked by dominant public assumption? One answer lies in ornamentation's ability to disguise symbolic language as simple embellishment. Counterpublics often have developed coded visual languages to communicate with one another safely and to let one another know that they are not alone in the world. These languages include the Queen's vernacular, a coded spoken language that queers use to combat oppression with wit, the hanky code, a visual language that started as a joke in the Village Voice that turned in a wonderful way for people to connect with one another and to connect their kinks with other people's kinks. And even the words of David Drake, also known as Dave the Potter, whose words on pots were voices of inspiration to slaves who had also learned to read and write against incredible odds. So while looking at the secret codes that evolved from while these secret codes evolve from a real fear of violence, they remain effective even when the threat of violence is not the dominant concern. They remain effective as a way for members of a counterpublic to hail one another. Looking at this sort of visual language in the context of contemporary ceramics, we can see that the purposes that these counterpublic visual cues serve in the craft art discourse are vital. So in the work of Nikki Green, coded language appears in visual references to flowers and mushrooms and hankies. When she was interviewed by Sarah Hotchkiss on KQED, she discussed the sub-Rosa elements of her work. She said, on one hand, there's the covert nature of your experiencing this thing visually or even materially, and you don't understand it conceptually. The point is that it's not for anybody but the select few in the know to understand. Hotchkiss goes on to reply saying, like the hanky codes of the 70s and 80s and other modes of coded signaling of queerness, Green enjoys communicating certain messages to specific members of her community. Green says, it's like I see you, and this is for you. While much of Nikki Green's work speaks publicly about her identity as a Jewish trans woman, there are elements of it that are meant to directly hail her own counterpublic. This shows the first function of counterpublic ornamentation, which is to tell a viewer from that counterpublic that she is seen by that artist, and by extension, that she is seen by the art world. In talking to people from counterpublics about this sort of art, the phrase that I heard most often was, I felt seen. Going back to Warner's work as a tool to understand this, we can see that addressing the art world as a single public dismisses the non-dominant experiences that exist there. To be seen becomes a rare and important moment for someone whose experience is not the default. So the same way that all ornamentation can open up gateways for new voices to enter into the arts conversation, counterpublic ornamentation calls out a sense of belonging and sends a direct invitation to demographics that are underrepresented in our sphere. The second function of counterpublic ornamentation is to create a place for counterpublic conversations to happen within the art world. An example of the need for this sub-Rosa space appears in Jane Harris's critique of Simone Lee's exhibition Molting, in which she said, while its original title, We the Black Woman, spoke directly to that intent, Lee's desire to avoid narrow essentialist readings led to the more evocative title Molting. These narrow essentialist readings are an obstacle for an artist discussing counterpublic experience inside the space of the public. The tendency for a viewer to simplify the reading of a work to a stereotyped understanding of the experience prevents the sort of nuanced conversation that an artist might be able to have within a sub-Rosa space. Both of these conversations are vital, both in the arts and publicly. But in order to have both these conversations, an artist must leave some of the conversation in her work to be had by those who are also members of her counterpublic. This allows that self-determined conversation, that sub-Rosa conversation that Warner wrote about, to evolve without the dominant intrusion of the dominant public opinion. So, in Roberto Lugo's We Are All Kings, the conversation is about race on both the dominant public and the counterpublic level. The vessel is adorned with the images of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and Rodney King. Tying the more recent three names back to the name of Rodney King talks about this brutality as a legacy. The title, We Are All Kings, shows that this violence reaches through the community and is not just an act against an individual man, or even against four individual men. Visually, the vessel, like so many of Lugo's pots, is covered in seductive Baroque ornamentation. This ornamentation serves both as a visual lure and also as camouflage for counterpublic ornamentation. Lugo's vessel ends in the finial of a crown. The crown fits perfectly with the visual theme of the pot, appearing as another Baroque flourish. However, if a viewer had grown up around car culture, she would recognize this crown as a dashboard-mounted air freshener, popular in the early 90s. Now, a rumor spread that these air fresheners were made by a company owned by a member of the KKK, and that that person had made public inflammatory statements about how he had profited off the very people that he was persecuting. In the end, this story turned out to mostly be urban legend. But like the urban legend of the suffragettes, it illustrates true ideas. The counterpublic discourse is asking its own members, how are we contributing to the very people who are working to impede us and to destroy us? By bringing that discussion into his work, Roberto Lugo can speak directly to people in the know. And then by bubbling that question inside the gallery space, it carries further into the conflicts involved in being a person of color contributing to the craft art world, a subpublic, our subpublic, that still struggles with the issues of diversity, representation, and equity. Ornamentation can serve not only as a gateway into the arts conversation, it can also serve as an almost magical sub-Rosa chamber in which an artist can directly address her own counterpublic within the public space of the gallery. Which brings us back to the legend of the suffragette china painter. I was heartbroken to not uncover these fabled amateur china paintings of violet roses and Holloway gates. But it's fitting that none of those pieces ended up in the museum collections where I searched so thoroughly for them. Those visual conversations were never meant for the public who carefully packed things into boxes to be saved for our future generations. Because those conservators were never part of the conversation. They couldn't hear the important things locked in those clumsily amateur-painted violets. Ceramics, our medium, as it's often said, is a medium that can last millennia or be destroyed in a careless act of dusting. The act of secreting symbols and cultural languages into our work is an act of defiance against history as it is being written. Art, amongst many other things, is a record of history that historians fail to record. As the work of counterpublic artists gets logged into the conversation and the preservation world of the museum, their coded language also gets preserved for the future. These symbols, hidden in contemporary art, whether contemporary visual slang or a recovered part of the history of an artist's counterpublic, can remain sub rosa, locked and logged into the historical record, and patiently wait until a day can come when it can enter a public discourse that's ready to hear all of its story. Thank you. I have a couple minutes for questions, but before I do, I want to say this is my website, and on it you can find my Grayson Perry paper in blog format, as well as a link to the original long-form paper. And there's also a place on there where you can subscribe to my newsletter, and I will eventually write a long-form version of this paper based on some of the conversations and questions I've had here, and that will let you know when that comes out. Are there any questions? Yes? The last image that I showed? This? Oh, the very first image. That very first image is a Royal Dalton ware. And there's a lot of, in doing this kind of investigation, you run across a lot of antiques dealers that sell suffragette jewelry and suffragette pottery that is really just pottery and jewelry that happen to be in violet, green, and white. And that is one of those things. There were, apparently Limoges also did a release of a line, but it was much later. It was actually kind of a 1930s retrospective of this is what that pottery looked like, and also kind of released for those same commercial needs. Thank you. Anybody else? No? All right, thank you very much.